everyone. I hope you all had a really lovely half-term holiday. Today I'm going to finish reading Stig of the Dump. I hope you have enjoyed the story. He made Lou put her head to the ground, and for a time they heard nothing, and then the thump came again. By now there was a shushing among the tribe, and some of them seemed to be hearing something too. Everyone became quite silent, and after a time the sound could be heard through the air, as well as being a shake in the hillside. There was a long time between thumps. Barney counted up to 20 quite slowly, but they kept coming, and they seemed to be coming closer. It could have been the footsteps of some great giant or monster plodding unhurriedly towards them out of the marshy valley. Barney looked at Lou, and he could see what she was thinking. She was thinking the same thing. "What can it be, Lou?" he whispered. "I don't know. Could be anything. Could it be one of those brontosauruses?" But Lou hushed for silence. And then Barney too caught another sound that went with the thumps of the footsteps. Before each thump there was a sort of long-drawn wail, so that it sounded like "Ew, thump, ew, thump." And each time the whole chalky hill shook until they could feel it in their bones, sitting on the springy turf. Everyone had heard it now, even the chief and the old men, who Barney supposed might be a little deaf. The circle of tribesmen round the fire was breaking up, and everyone was moving towards the edge of the steep slope that plunged down to the valley. "Come on," said Barney. "We've got to see what it is." They got up and ran with the others. At the bottom of the valley the forest stretched away to the distant hills under the moonlight, and blankets of low mist lay with the trees poking their heads through them. They strained their eyes to see through the mist where the sound seemed to be coming from. Then Lou gasped and clutched Barney's arm and pointed. "Look," she breathed. "There it is." Barney saw it almost at the same moment, though he still didn't know what it was he saw. Out of the mist at the base of the hill there heaved itself every now and then a dark shape that stood up for a moment, and each time fell toward in their direction. And every time it appeared there came this wail, followed by the earth-shaking thump. And now there seemed to be extra sound attached to it. Between the wail and the thump, like this: "Ew, thump, ew, thump." And the sound seemed to be not one loud voice, but many voices. And then Barney could see that the dark shape had sort of strings or feelers joined to it. Dina, standing between them, had seen it now, and the hair was standing up on her neck and back, and Barney felt that this his was too. Still watching, fascinated, Lou said, "Barney, we're dreaming all this, of course. I'm going to pinch myself and then I'll wake up." "Don't you dare wake up and leave me here," said Barney. "Well, you pinch yourself at the same time," said Lou. They pinched themselves. Nothing happened. "Are you awake?" Barney asked. "No," replied Lou. "I know what," said Barney. "I'll pinch you." He pinched Lou and she squealed. "You don't have to do it so hard," she said. "Perhaps it's your dream and not mine. My turn to pinch you." She pinched him. "You beast, Lou, that hurts," said Barney. "Look, we can't both be dreaming the same dream, so we must be both awake. I wish we weren't." He took his eyes off the thing that turned to someone standing next to him. It was Stig. "Stig, thank goodness you're here," gasped Barney. "What is it, and what's going to happen?" Stig just looked at him in his usual not understanding way, but he grinned, and he really seemed quite cheerful and not at all worried. "Lou, here's Stig," said Barney. "He seems to think it's all right." "Does he?" said Lou, looking around. "Well, perhaps it is a tame thing, or a usual thing anyhow." They felt better with Stig standing so cheerfully beside them. But Dina suddenly decided that it was a thing she didn't like at all, turned tail, jerked the string from Lou's hand, and bolted with Lou after her, shouting, "Dina! Dina, come back!" "Nice thing, Dina. Dina, come here." And at the same time Stig made a wave come on to Barney, and some of the other men and started down the steep slope. Barney found himself running with him, panting. I'm coming, Stig! Wait for me, Stig, wait! You haven't got your spear, Stig! For he only just noticed that neither Stig nor the other men had brought their weapons with them. But now that he had started running down the hill, he knew he couldn't possibly stop, and he would be upon the thing before he had time to wonder any more what it was. This mist was the sort that wasn't there when you got to it, but spread the moonlight around like daylight. And Barney was still running down the last bit of hill when he could see quite plainly what it all was. The dark shape, the strings, the wail and the grunt and the thump. On the track leading along the base of the hill was a crowd of tribesmen. They were divided into two groups. Those nearer to him were pulling on ropes, those further away were working long poles. And the thing they were manhandling was a great, rough slab of dark rock, at least twice as high as the tallest man. And this was the way they were heaving it along. The slab of rock was lying flat on the ground. 12 men with pointed stakes pushed them under the edge of the rock and levered it about a foot off the ground. A much larger group of men pushed much longer poles under the rock as far as they would go, and lifted it still higher by pushing upwards on the poles. To the top ends of these poles, long ropes of twisted hide had been tied, which passed over the top of the rock to the men in front. When the rock was high enough, the men in front pulled all together on the ropes. The rock rose until it was standing upright, seemed to stop there for a second, and then fell forward with the mighty thump that they had heard on the top of the hill. And the voice of the monster was the heave-ho of the men as they heaved together on the levers and ropes, and grunted together at the difficult point when the rock was halfway to standing up. Barney was almost disappointed at the disappearance of the monster, but there was no time to stand around. The job was now to get the rock up the hill, and all the new helpers from the camp were needed. Without a pause in the slow footsteps of the rock, they joined in the work, or rather it was like joining in a game or a dance. Barney grabbed the end of a rope behind Stig and watched what he did. They faced the stone and had to walk towards it while the men at the other side lifted the poles back to fit them together under the rock. Then they had to take up the slack, but not pull until the rock was lifted to the halfway mark. Then all together, with the men on the other two ropes, they had to take the strain, heave on the rope until the rock was standing upright, and then heave no more, because it was all no use pulling the rock over towards them. It could fall by itself. Barney soon found it tiring and wondered how long they would keep going like that. He started to say, wouldn't it be better if... But as soon as he started talking, Stig trod on his toe, and then the rope was jerked through his hand as they lifted the poles back for the next heave. He noticed then that nobody was making suggestions. Nobody was arguing. Nobody was even giving orders. They just sang their wailing song. Eeyore! Pulled together, walked up a few steps together, rested together while the pole pushers worked, and Barney began to see that they could keep this up for hundreds of miles. And they probably had, because he couldn't think where they could find slabs of rock like this anywhere near here. Of course they couldn't go straight up the hill. It was too steep, and there was a grassy track slanting along the hillside, and up it they slowly humped the great rock. They were getting nearer the camp now, and the women and children ran out to meet them and shout encouragement. Barney heard a voice he recognized, and turned his head and saw Lou among them, holding an excited Dina. What are you going to do with it, Barney? She was saying. I can't help because I can't leave Dina. But as soon as he paid attention to what Lou was saying, he got trodden on and jerked again, so he gave up trying to hear what she was shouting. He thought he heard her say, wouldn't it be better if you had wheels? But there didn't seem to be much he could do about it. Now, although it was the steepest part of the track, they seemed to be going quicker. Barney had the feeling of being at the end of a race and making the final sprint. He looked round and saw the chief standing there alongside the track. Then he thought of Lou's question, and for the first time wondered what they were going to do with this lump of rock. He supposed it was some kind of present for the chief. He hoped he would like it. With a last couple of quick heaves, they laid the rock almost at the feet of the king. One man said something about a loud voice, and all the ropemen and pullmen fell on their faces towards the king. Barney did too this time. He was too tired to do anything else. The king raised his arm, more speechless. It seemed the job was not finished. He sat up and saw that leading away from where the rock was, a sort of raised mound. This end of it was level with the ground, but the far end ran out to the tops of the three other huge stones that were standing upright lower down the hillside. Barney thought he could see now what they brought the slab all the way up the hill for. Along this mound they could put it so that it rested on top of the three standing stones, and there it would be, a house for the king, or a temple, or whatever it was that people put big stones across the top of others for. It seemed a grand idea to Barney. He could see now that it wasn't going to be the same as bringing it along the track. Now it was going downhill. If they weren't careful, it could go bounding away down the slope and even knock the standing stones flying like a lot of skittles. The old king stood speaking to the group of important men. He seemed to be pointing to the eastern sky with one hand and urging them with the other. Barney looked towards where the king was pointing. Was the sky beginning to get light? Was it nearly morning? Was there something that had to be done before the night came to an end? Before the end of the shortest night? The night that seemed to have been going on for such a long time. The women and children scrambled down the hill to get a good view of the standing stones, and there was a lot of scolding and cuffing of little ones who got themselves in the way of where the stone was to come. The men with the poles and ropes made ready again. This time it was different. Because of the steepness of the slope, they couldn't pull from the front, but they had to do all the lifting and pushing from behind. And to stop the stone running away down the hill, there was a rope leading uphill behind it, with a lot of people hanging on to act as a brake. Stig took hold near the end of this, and Barney attached himself last of all as anchorman. There was no hearty heave-hoing this time. It was easy enough to lift the rock on edge, but then everybody watched anxiously as the brake rope was paid out and the rock was allowed to sink gently forwards. There was no loud thump either, but a lot of hissing. The steps along the top of the mound towards the top of the standing stones were even more anxious. One mistake and the stone could topple sideways off the mound and charge off downhill. Barney thought the women and children were standing dangerously close on each side, but they made 6 steps safely along the mound, each time letting the stone settle gently down by the brake rope. And now it was standing on its edge near the end of the mound, ready to be lowered onto the top of the standing stones. The king was looking anxiously at the sky, which now showed a bright glow over the shoulder of the downs to the east. Sunrise couldn't be far off. The workers on the brake rope took the strain as the stone began to fall forward. But what was all this? Tina, of all things, scrambling up the mound, straight in front of the topping stone, with Lou in desperate pursuit, and then Lou's voice shouting, "Stop! Don't let it down! There's a baby!" And there was Lou disappearing in front of the stone too. The stone was moving. Everyone on the brake rope was doing his best to hold it back, but once it had started, it was almost impossible. Barney on the end dug his heels into the slippery turf, but he could feel himself being dragged slowly forward. And then he saw, just beside him on the hillside, a scrubby thorn tree, weather-beaten and stunted, but with strong roots clenching the earth. "Stig!" he gasped. "That tree!" Stig looked round and saw. With one hairy arm, Stig reached out and grabbed the trunk of the tree. The rope was wrapped around his other wrist, with his bones seemed to crackle as his arms took the strain. But the brake rope stopped moving forward, trying not to fumble. Barney passed the end of the rope twice round the little tree and pulled it, and Stig grinned as he saw that he could let go. The hide rope stretched, the roots of tree strained in the ground, But Barney let himself look at the stone and saw that it was not moving. And then Lou appeared from under the tile stone, followed by Dina, and carrying a naked black-haired Stig baby. The king shouted impatiently. Barney let the end of the rope run out round the tree trunk. The great slab fell forward with a hollow sound onto the tops of the standing stones, and over the shoulder of the downs appeared a red spark. And the valley was flooded with light. It was sunrise. From the low mist in the bottom of the valley appeared the spire of a church, the tops of oast houses and electricity pylons. The solid forest was gone, and there were the squares of cornfield, orchard, and hop garden. There were the villages and the distant chimneys of cement works, and the broad ribbon of the main road sweeping down the hill below. Barney looked round the hillside. The people of the tribe had disappeared. There were no huts, no sign of a campfire. They had all vanished with the last shades of darkness. But one thing had not changed. The 3 stones with the great slab on top were still before his eyes, weathered now, with grey lichen growing on them. The mound was not there, but the stones stood just as they had done when he let go of the last rope. Sitting against them was Lou, blinking her eyes at the rising sun as if she was waking from a deep sleep and holding Dina in her arms. "Oh, Barney, I've had such a funny dream," said Lou. "I'm glad I've woken up, though." "So did I," said Barney. "Are you sure we've woken up?" Lou looked round. "Well, I dreamt about a tribe of people long ago," she said. "They've all gone, and now it's now, so it must have been a dream." "What are we doing here, then?" asked Barney. Lou opened her eyes at that. "Good gracious," she said. "We don't usually wake up on top of a hill, do we?" She curled herself up at the foot of the stone and shut her eyes. "I'm going to dream myself back to bed," she said firmly. Barney shook her. "Get up, Lou," he said. "It isn't that sort of dream at all. We really are here. We've got to get back to Granny's somehow." Barney knew it was something more than a dream. The tiredness in his arms and legs told him that he really had been holding the great stone that looked as if it had been there for thousands of years. He walked round to the front of the stones where the open side looked over the valley, and there, sitting in the entrance, as if he was on his own front porch, was Stig. Barney gasped and Stig grinned. Lou put her head round the stone and gasped too. "Stig!" she exclaimed. "What are you doing here? If you're a midsummer fairy or whatever the others were, you're supposed to vanish too." "But I told you," said Barney. "Stig's always here. He's my friend." Barney and Lou have almost forgotten how they got back to the house that summer morning. They remember catching the pony who was grazing peacefully on the hilltop, and riding back half asleep, pitter-clatter through the empty lanes, with Stig walking beside them. They remember falling into their beds and waking very late on Midsummer Day. Probably they agreed on the way back not to say anything about what happened. Anyhow, what could they say? It wasn't until quite a long time later that they went with their parents for a picnic on the North Downs where the 4 stones stand. And as they ate their sandwiches, their parents got into an argument about Stone Ages and Bronze Ages and about how the stones had got there at all. Until Barney said, without thinking, they had flint spears, and it was the heave-ho that did it. And everybody thought about this quite a lot, and had to admit that Barney was probably right, though they couldn't think how he knew. And then Barney and Lou said together, "But I wonder how the baby got there." And that was a question nobody could answer. What about Stig? Well, if you ask Barney, he will say, in an offhand manner, that he's still living in the dump. The grown-ups never really knew just how weird he was. But they got used to the idea that wherever there was a pile of old thrown-away things and an unseen Stig was likely to be poking around in it. And whenever there was a particularly odd job to be done, like making sure a rainwater butt didn't spring a leak, and when it was empty and overflow and when it was full, or a new tool for lifting parsnips, then someone would say, "Let's get Stig to fix it." Actually, the dump's filling up fast now, and Stig may be on the move. One report was that he'd been seen working at a garage by the main road, where they collect old wrecked cars and put the pieces in rusty piles. And somebody else said he saw him in the back of a lane of a woody country at the top of the downs, mending a chicken run with an old wire mattress. It certainly sounded like Barney's friend Stig, but perhaps it was only a relative of his. Okay, 3N. I hope you enjoyed our Stig of the Dump novel, and I will see you tomorrow for a new book.